Watson. I'm so excited to have Dr. Bettina L. Love here with me in conversation for her new book that came out last year, Punished for Dreaming, how school reform harms Black children and how we heal. So thank you so much, Dr. Love, who is the William F. Russell Professor at Teachers College at Columbia University. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
Thanks so much. I remember when this book came out, there was so much buzz. I read and got a copy and I read it and I reread it again because it was it's such a powerful narrative because in addition to outlining, I think, some of the challenges that we face as it relates to education, what I found so interesting with the stories that you were able to weave through this narrative. So tell me a little bit about that. You start the book off talking a little bit about growing up in Rochester, New York. And I was wondering, because in some ways that I think sets the tone for this book. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Anytime I get to talk about home, I light up because I'm from upstate New York, Rochester, New York, and we take it seriously from being from upstate New York. But I think what the book was really trying to do is to say there's two things happening. There's the story of the hip hop generation, and that's my generation. And we are the post-civil rights generation. We are the generation who will go to schools throughout their whole schooling career, supposedly integrated, right? And so I wanted to tell the story of the post-civil rights generation and the hip hop generation. And that's my story. I was born in 1979.
Yeah.
And to center where I was from, to center my city was really important because there's no generation like ours. I think we are squarely unique as this generation, right? And to talk about how school reform, the very idea of school reform was built on my generation's back. So the idea of mass incarceration didn't exist for our grandparents in the way that we see it and we know it now. You talk to your grandparents, they don't know anything about standardized testing and charter schools and policing schools. They know nothing about that. So I really wanted to center my generation, the hip hop generation, and what we have experienced through school reform. And I thought the stories were important because oftentimes we can get lost in school reform. We can get lost in all the policies.
It becomes very wonkish, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
it just doesn't make it like, okay, another reform, another policy, no child left behind. So I wanted to add people and their families and their stories so you can understand how this policy impacts a child into adulthood and impacts their families and impacts their communities. And so I really wanted to stretch myself as a researcher and a writer to really think about how I tell stories through education reform.
Yeah, no, that's so powerful because often we wake up and we say, how did we get into this mess? But I think
Yes.
what you've been able to do in this book is to show in a very kind of deliberate way, and it's
Thank
very
you.
intentional, right? I mean, in many ways, that this is a pattern that didn't just happen overnight,
Right,
but that has culminated into this
right.
disaster that we call that's been called ed reform. So
Mhm.
again, outline a little bit more about how the education reform has in fact been disastrous for Black children. I mean, I'm sure
Yeah, I think
it
the
can
first
go
thing,
on.
yeah, I mean, this is a very critical year. If you think about where we are, this is the 70th year of Brown, right? We're going to say this is the 70-year mark of Brown versus the Board of Education.
Yeah.
And so this is a very critical year, I think, of reflection to try to understand how we got to a point where we had amazing Black educators in Black schools and Black schools doing amazing things with Black children, right? We could talk about the work of James Anderson, Minnesota Walker, Linda Tillman, right? We can go in and think about what we had and what we lost in these last 70 years and how it has been framed around school reform. And so what I really try to do is take you through pre-Brown to post-Brown to the 80s and really stay with the 80s and talk about Reagan and talk about school reform and talk about this little 35-page report called A Nation at Risk and how it changed education forever and how it put a target on Black children's backs in our communities, but also try to weave in how No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top and mass incarceration and police in schools and zero tolerance and broken window theory. All these things kind of exist And we don't really put education at the center of those things. So we will talk about mass incarceration, but we won't really talk about how it impacted schools, and the prison industrial complex impacted schools, and how schools are part of that. They're not somewhere off to the side. And so what I try to do is I use the 80s really as a turning point in education, where you see a nation at risk, you see the DARE program, you see cops in schools, you see zero tolerance policies. And the 80s are a critical point where we see school reform and crime reform merge. And they become so tied to each other, you can't tear them apart anymore. And that's where we are right now.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very interesting. I remember hearing you talk about graduating from high school and looking around and seeing
Mhm.
that a large percentage of students, they weren't graduating with you, and
Yeah.
really thinking about, well, what happened to those students? Where did they go? And
And
that's a very powerful moment, I think.
And it's so important, because if we don't, I'm an abolitionist, so I'm always trying to understand the root cause. And where do we think about accountability? And here I am, a 17-year-old kid, graduating high school. And I went to a big high school. I went to a vocational high school, 2,000 kids up in that joker. We had an airplane in our high school, an
Wow.
actual working gas station at our high school, right? And so my freshman class is between 650, 800 kids is my freshman class. And we graduate around 100 kids. Where did all these kids go?
Mm,
Where did they go? And I just remember distinctly walking across the stage, thinking to myself, where are my friends?
yeah.
I came in 800, 750 strong, and here we are graduating 100 kids.
Mm,
And that has stuck with me and really was the center of this book, is trying to understand and make sense of what happened to young kids like me in the 80s and 90s, and try to tell our story through education. I think we've told the story of crack. I think we've told the story of mass incarceration, but we haven't told the story and linked that
mm.
to education reform.
No, that's so important. You mentioned being an abolitionist, and I was curious, what is abolitionist teaching for folks who have heard of the term
Mhm.
but not quite sure what it is? How do
Yeah,
you frame it?
Yeah, I think when people hear abolition, the first thing they think is tear it down, tear it down, tear it down. And that is a part of abolition, but that's not the main thing we want to do as abolitionists. The main thing we want to do is be judged, as we say in abolitionist communities, of how we care and how we love for each other, how we
Mm,
build new structures, how we
mm,
think differently about accountability, and how we hold and how we talk about harm and redemption and love and grace. But we also want to hold people accountable who have done harm, and
mm,
then think about how we have different structures and different systems within the harm that has been done, so that harm never is done before. So
mm.
abolition is so much about love and compassion, but holding people accountable for
Yeah,
harm. So if
yeah.
you look in the book, I name names.
Mhm, mhm.
Right. I talk about and I try to link these things, because I believe as an abolitionist, we can't have new structures and new understanding if we don't know what has been done to us and who did it to us. Because what we know through reform is that the same folks who've done the harm will come and tell you that they now have the solution for the harm that they have done.
Mm, mm. Feels very
Nah,
that
you're
way.
not gonna make money hand over fist again, trying to tell us you're gonna be the remedy for the harm that you have done.
That's
And
right.
so, as abolitionists teaching, we are trying to love and repair and build, and we're also trying to tear down these structures that are not needed and do harm.
Yeah,
Wow, we are loving and holding people accountable.
yeah, and part of that accountability also means educational reparations, as you point out,
Yes.
right? So what does that look like too? Because we gotta be honest, right?
For me, it's we talk in education about, and I think we're getting to the point to talk about harm. Like we have all these statistics for the mistreatment, the inequality of Black children, but we don't call it harm. We
Mhm,
just call it data. We call it racism,
yeah,
right? We call it anti-Blackness. It is harm, and it is impacting us for generations to come. And so if we know that our students are going to schools that are going to do harm, we are going to schools that are going to give them a second rate at best education. And what Tyrone Howard says is that when we have statistics and data that are predictable outcomes, that
mm,
is a problem.
yeah,
That
yeah,
is a problem. And so how do we repair? Another word for repair is reparations. So
Mm.
what the book tries to do is end with the call for educational reparations, and not just a theoretical call. I got a chance to work with amazing Black women, policymakers and economists. And so we started to run the numbers. We came up with these categories of harm. So curriculum, policing, suspensions, buildings. And we started to look at, and these women came up with the formulas to create and understand reform and policy as harm and
Mm.
what it would look like. And just for my generation is $2 trillion. And that is a conservative estimate just for the last 40 years of educational harm. And I'll give you just one category how this
Yeah.
works. Let's look at the curriculum. We know that in 2010, we had over 100,000 Black students that qualified for AP, but they didn't have teachers to teach AP, or they were not recommended for AP. So they should have been in AP. They had the grades, they had the test scores, they had everything they need to be in AP, but they were not in AP. Now, those 100,000 students, those who go off to college, will
Yeah.
pay more in their student loans.
No
So
doubt.
they will pay upwards to 3,000 to 9,000 more in their student loans simply because they were not allowed to go into college with those credits that would transfer from their high school, because they were denied that because of the color of their skin and the schools that they go to. That is reparation, because I am paying more. And we know that debt will be cumulative because of student loan interest and all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
When a child gets suspended, they don't go home with a check.
Mm.
Everybody get paid when a child gets suspended. They
Yes.
don't go home with lunch, dinner, computer, tutor, nothing, but everybody still get paid. This
Mm.
is what we mean by reparations. If we're doing harm, then we have to think about what repair looks like.
Right. The repair piece is so critically
Mhm.
important, because oftentimes we talk about as you pointed out, we put this out as data, but not necessarily looking at harm.
Yes,
But that now we're talking about decades and decades of harm. And what does that
generations
have?
of harm.
Yeah, and the psychological impact
Mhm.
of that becomes
Mhm.
important. So, as we're talking about reparations, I also know that you've been very critical of what you call white philanthropy, and I also remember hearing the late Dr. John Hope Franklin talk about bad philanthropy, because often
Mhm.
we think, "Oh, philanthropy is just great." And he said, "No, no, no. Sometimes it can be
No.
pretty bad." So, talk a little bit about your critique of that piece as well, and how this fits into the narrative.
Yes, thank you for that. We have to understand, particularly within a US context, philanthropy being what we would call a cooling agent
Mm.
of Black resistance. And so I'm quoting here from the scholar William Reynolds, and he talks about how, if you look at philanthropy throughout time, whenever there is chaos, whenever there is a racial uprising, whenever Black folks start to, we hit these streets, here comes a flood of money. Here comes the Ford Foundation.
So
Here
that
comes,
George Floyd, right? When
right.
everything
We
dried
saw,
up.
as
Yeah.
Dave Stallball would call it, we saw blood money
Mm.
everywhere. Everything started to get funded, right? We saw Black Lives Matter get like $90 million.
Mhm.
And so philanthropy is there to say, hey, there is racial unrest. Let's give them what they want in the ways in which we can control the narrative of what they want.
Mm.
And so you will get these type of things. You will get charter schools. You will get more funding for after school programs. You will get these type of very, I would say, now I have a big critique about charter schools, but you will get the things that they can deal with, things that they will understand as progress. The things that we want as progress, they will not fund that, but they will slush fund this
Yeah.
type of progress. And that is what white philanthropy does. So white philanthropy is really working as part of the government's larger plan.
Mm.
And they get to do things the government can't do and fund things the government can't do. But it's still very, very tightly wound to what a government's reform models are.
Yeah.
And so they're
Yeah.
just working as another arm of the government through Bible 3Cs and all of the ways in which we get to funnel money through nonprofits. But at
Mm.
the end of the day, they're not doing anything radical, anything transformational for actual Black lives and radical Blackness for liberation.
Yeah. No, that's so important. And it's important to offer that critique and understanding of what is in fact happening. One of the things when I was reading this book that caught my attention as well is where you say, no, there is no school to prison pipeline,
Mhm.
that Black lives are carceral. And
Mhm.
it stood out to me because we often talk about this pipeline, right? And it becomes part of the narrative that we just say over and over again. But what
Mhm.
you're saying is that the ways in which one's very existence is carceral, and it doesn't and that's ongoing, right? I mean, is that
Mhm.
the point you're making?
Yes, I think the framing of a prison to school pipeline doesn't do it justice. I think it's too neat. And
Mm,
as folks like David Starbo, Dylan Rodriguez have talked about, Erica Miner, Miriam Kaba, it's too neat
yeah.
because we, as Black folks in this country, there's a you are presumed guilty. You
Mm,
walk in a room, you are guilty. The
mm,
way you walk into schools, and there has to be, you have to walk in line. You can't talk in the hallways. The way we think about policy and who gets what, these are all carceral. And
mm.
so it's not a pipeline. You already in it. The
Right,
school is the prison. The school is mimicking the ways that the prison is set up. So there's no pipeline. It's not like you leave school and
right.
then you go to this.
Some neat
No, you're
structure.
in it already. You're sitting in it already.
That's right.
The way
Yeah.
we're watching schools in Houston, Texas, take away libraries to put in detention centers.
Mm,
Where we have in Chicago, they had a school that had a booking station inside the school in Chicago. That's not a pipeline, you sitting in it. But also, we think about Breonna Taylor. We think about George Floyd. We think about a young girl who is looking at bees and the police get called on her because she's looking at trees. We look at Black folks who go into a home and you are thinking about buying a home and the police get called on you because they couldn't believe that you're buying a home in this neighborhood. We think about going to the doctor
mm,
and the doctor not even believing what you're saying about your body because you are Black. We think about Black women who are dying at extreme rates for just trying to, the most vulnerable time in their life is childbirth, and no one would listen to you because they don't believe you. That means our whole lives are carceral.
mhm.
We are presumed guilty, deviant, and destructive from birth.
Yeah, and it
So it
doesn't
makes our lives carceral.
end, and so we can see the ways in which even Black women who are in high positions, whether it's the president of Harvard or
Yes,
wherever, still
yes,
dealing with this notion of being a criminal, right? Of
right.
being
Presumed guilty.
presumed guilty. Yeah,
She was
yeah.
presumed guilty by the public.
Mm,
Harvard never said that she plagiarized.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
But it was the public who said
Yeah,
that this Black
yeah.
woman wasn't worthy enough. She wasn't good enough. Of course, she had to plagiarize to get to that position. She's
Mm,
guilty.
mm. Wow, wow. Yeah. So I think it's really important to rethink
Hmm.
about how we approach this notion of carceral, which I think is so critical. I remember when I graduated from Georgetown as an undergrad, so many of my classmates were going off to teach for America. There was like it was like in the 90s, and everybody
Hmm.
wanted to do teach for America because that was like the thing to do. And over the years, of course, we've seen the critiques and criticism of how this program was kind of established and designed. I know you have had some concerns as well, and I was wondering
Hmm.
what are your critiques of Teach for America?
We could do a whole podcast on Teach for America, but I think if anybody who cares about education, who thinks education is important, should just know a few things about Teach for America. Number one, you got 6 weeks of training to now come into classrooms with babies who need the most. Nowhere in history would you do that.
No, no, it's malpractice, right?
It's malpractice. You wouldn't do that in anything. You wouldn't let somebody build your house with 6 weeks of
Right,
practice.
right.
You wouldn't let somebody open up your heart with 6 weeks of practice. No one would do that. And so if you start to just pull back the pieces and say, hold on, they got 6 weeks of practice. They don't have any teaching experience. They don't have a degree in education. And they're going to go to the place and go into schools that need most experienced, most seasoned, most veteran teachers. That doesn't make sense. Now,
Mm,
it's great for a business model, but for students and real lives, it doesn't make sense. And
mm,
so for me, I just always try to explain that very principles of Teach for America to everyday people so they can start to, oh, no, that doesn't sit right with me. Well, that's what's happening.
yeah.
And then you can stop blaming Black children and Black communities. Well, look at these test scores. Well, look who's teaching them,
That's right.
right?
That's
We got
right.
to get to the root cause.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. The root cause. Yeah, Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, so many gems in this book here. And again, I want to encourage all of our readers, all of our listeners to go and get Punished for Dreaming. It's a wonderful book. Tell me, what do you want folks to get from this? I mean, obviously, this is you poured your soul into this book, and I can tell as I'm reading it, you're passionate, you're fired up about this issue. But what do you want folks to get from this book?
I'm just grateful. I never thought the book would be a New York Times bestseller. I didn't, I'm so grateful that people really, gravitated towards the book. I would say to your listeners, if you go to bettinalove.com, there's an album that goes with this book.
A
There's
coloring book,
a
right? Right.
coloring book, a study
Mhm.
guide that goes with this book. What I really wanted people to just be emotionally invested in the lives of Black children through
Mm.
song, through coloring, through the stories you read in the book, through the trailers you can get. If you read this book and you believe that harm has been done, I want people to start to ask, what does repair look like? And I think not just for education, for our society right now, for our country right now, if you believe that Black folks have been harmed, then you have to believe that there is some type of repair that is needed. And that's really what I wanted folks to get out this book. Because I think we talk too much about, like I said, disparities and equality. All those things are important. But if you believe it, then you have to believe that if harm has happened, you have to believe in repair.
And that
Nobody can
discussion
just
has to
keep
start
going through
there.
harm.
Yeah, yeah. And that discussion has to start with the honest, right, conversation about harm. You can't get
Yes,
to the next level until you've
yes.
acknowledged it.
And we
That's
skip
what I
through
love
that.
about. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We skip over harm all the time and repair. We just go to data, we go to solutions. Nobody's apologized, nobody's taking accountability, and nobody has said the people who've done the harm, you can't come back until you get yourself together. We don't talk like that in education. We
Yeah.
go from reform to reform, policy to policy, harm to harm to harm to harm.
So how do we, I guess, shift to change? I mean, we're coming up with a presidential election in 2024. Very concerned about the state of where things are. Obviously, we got to have that conversation about harm. But in addition to that, what can folks do? But they read your book. They're what can they do on a day-to-day basis to say, I want to be a part of this revolution and this change. I want to be a
Yes, that's a really
abolitionist.
great question.
Yeah.
I think one of the first things to do is what my grandmother would say is sweep outside your own front door.
I love it.
Because I think too often people think change starts out in the street, and it does. But we need change at your house. It's how you raise your children. It's how you talk to your children. It's how you talk to your partner. It's how you talk to the people in your community. What books do you read at your house? Where do you send your children to school? Where do you shop? Where do you spend your money? We think so much of the work is about, railing against the folks at the top. And it is. We can do both. But we got to make sure our house is in order
That's right.
because then the work is real. The
Mm,
work is not performative. Too often, I talk about this in all my books, too often the work is like from 9 to 5.
mm.
And then you go home and no, 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 no. Keep that same energy when you go to the house. We got folks doing diversity, equity, inclusion work only from 9 to 5.
Doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. We've had things in this country like January 6th. Those people belong to somebody.
Mm,
So I'm always saying, go get your people.
mm. So get your people.
Go
Yeah.
get your people. Talk to your people. Talk
Right.
to your children.
Right.
Talk to your husband. Talk to your partner. Talk to your grandparents. We got to be able to, in our own locus of control, to help inform the more people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really the work.
Yeah. And that can be done from the privacy of everybody's homes, right? In their
Yes.
home where
Do,
you are. And I think that's what
do,
Malcolm said, right? That
yes.
you got to kind of deal with where people are. Malcolm X was very, very
Yes.
intentional about that.
Yes,
Absolutely.
I'm always like, well, what do I do about this big social issue? Oh, it's there,
Yeah.
and I know it seems huge, but if everybody would do their work,
Mm,
if everybody would read more and love more and be more compassionate and have more empathy and more understanding and be quiet for a while,
yeah.
it's about our own work and teaching our children that
Yeah.
we would have a shift in our society.
Yeah. No, well said. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I always believe everyone has their lanes. And so part of what you've been able to do is help us to understand these issues better.
Thank you.
And so I appreciate you for being here. And again, want to encourage everyone to get a copy of the book. It will change your life. If you're a professor, have your undergrad and graduate students read
Thank
this
you.
book because it's very, very important and timely for the era that we're living in right now. So Dr. Bettina L. Love, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for all the great work that you do.
Appreciate you. Thank you.